right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you for returning. We will now begin our second panel on future war and hybrid warfare. Today we have Michelle Watson, Gabriel Eleftheriou, David Betts, and we will have the moderator be Dakota Wood. Thank you, all of you.
So is this working on that? Yeah, okay. So we're gonna stick to the timeline, and I think all of us really enjoy engaging with the audience, but we certainly want to hear the material first. So we're not going to be really constrained on trying to truncate 15 minutes into 5. So we'll do that. But it's all of the discussions almost have been against the backdrop of the Russia-Ukraine war. And what strikes me is more of a practitioner, career in the U.S. military, is that we have economic interests, we have military or political interests. We've been told not to use the word geopolitics from yesterday, but nevertheless it's there. And yet, despite all the good intentions, we often find ourselves in conflict. So there are these realities to military conflict between states, and it takes various forms. Usually we get it wrong when we try to predict, but we're going to have some forecasts perhaps about the future of conflict as we move forward. Again, I think Ukraine is instructive, or it illuminates enduring realities that for all the Starlink and unmanned systems and attempts at directed energy as a counter-drone technology, we still have trench warfare, barbed wire, and some brutality at the end of a bayonet and knife. So there's this weird kind of mixture of old and new, even here within the 21st century, and I trust that we'll get into some of these things. So let's just kick it off, and we'll go right here with Michelle.
Thank you. I do have a few slides. Okay, maybe next slide. Oh, I can do this, right? Right, okay. First of all, I wanted to say thank you. Everyone else has said basically as many thank yous in many different ways. I cannot do James Bond analogies, but I will say thank you, Melissa, John, Logan from Danube. Really appreciate it. And I have also not met Luca, but I do have to just say one James Bond reference. I think Luca might be like Moneypenny. So I'm not sure where she is, but I hope I meet her at some point. But she's been very helpful. And Jim from Heritage, thank you guys for inviting me. This is my first trip to Budapest ever, and I'm enjoying every minute of it, so thank you for that. I'm going to talk today about the Russia-Ukraine war from a slightly different perspective. Actually, let me admit that, from a very different perspective. And that's from the private sector or from a business organization perspective. Yep. Few disclaimers at first. Number one, I am not a Russia hybrid expert by any stretch of the imagination. And I am not representing Deloitte today in my presentation. My presentation is just based upon my own experience and my own perspectives and learnings. All right. I've been in information systems and information security or cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, for 25 years, over 25 years now. And I started in Silicon Valley. So I've always focused on the high-tech industries. A lot of my perspective is from that high-tech industry and Silicon Valley viewpoint. So when I was asked to speak on this Russia-Ukraine warfare topic, I said I'd be delighted to speak on this, but with information warfare focus and through a private sector lens. Yep. So what do I mean by this? I'd like to cover 5 points. First of all, when I look at the Russian hybrid warfare, I see a similar strategy to China's unrestricted warfare. And we just had this very lively debate on China, but I will say it's something that I've studied for a while. The book Unrestricted Warfare is a great read, and I highly recommend anyone that has any dealings or any interest in China, read Unrestricted Warfare. The premise of it is not unlike the Russian hybrid warfare, which is traditional boundaries in warfare are gone. And it's gone beyond what we call hot warfare, traditional war. And it encompasses a by any means necessary whatever's possible, whatever goes. Unrestricted warfare really does talk about how whatever it takes to prevail. Yep. All right, so kind of as a level set, I want to share two definitions that I found in an article from National Intelligence Officer Chris Bort. The definitions are, first of all, his for hybrid warfare is the following: a tactical operational environment using a mix of regular and irregular forces, means, and methods. Very high level, general. But his next definition on informational warfare is information, messaging, and initiatives designed to amplify social, political, and ideological divisions in an adversary society with the aim of weakening one's adversary from within. So that definition for information warfare is important because that's the basis from which I'm going to be talking. Next point, we've all seen how critical information systems are in fighting today's war in Ukraine. Yeah, and yeah, I haven't changed yet. Yes, thank you. No. Yeah, so information systems, absolutely essential in executing this Ukraine war. Cybersecurity, for example, it can ensure the integrity of communications, or it can disrupt, attack, and take down networks and information systems that are absolutely essential in this theater for targeting weapons, running drones, organizing troop movements, operating critical infrastructure, for example, energy, water, hospitals, civilian communication, and the like. And further, cyber is also an enabler for information warfare. Throughout this war in Ukraine, we've seen the most sustained offensive cyber ops that one country has launched against another. And I think it's important to note that others, for example, the US, the UK, and NATO cyber ops have all been heavily supporting Ukrainian cyber activities against Russia. And lastly, I want to highlight how the private sector companies in the Ukrainian information war is unprecedented. For example, companies, like Elon Musk's Starlink, which I'll talk about in greater detail in a moment, Amazon Web Services, Meta, I can't get used to saying Meta, Facebook, Twitter, can't get used to saying X, and then Google and Microsoft. Especially Microsoft Threat Intelligence Services have been very active in the Ukrainian theater. And I'm going to conclude with a look at how we can recognize and refute information and influence operations, especially disinformation. I'm going to show a kill chain that I helped create a couple of years ago, and we did it in the style of the Lockheed Martin cyber kill chain. So any of you are out there that understand anything about cyber, you cannot not work in cyber and not know Lockheed Martin's kill chain. All right, so we're going to conclude with that. Next, I want to talk about something called corporate statecraft. Okay, what is corporate statecraft? I co-created and co-taught a course at the Institute of World Politics, IWP, jointly with Professor Sigronis. And we created corporate statecraft as a course. It's also now a graduate certificate, I'm happy to say. And what is it? It examines the necessary relationship between private sector companies and government organizations. So why do we do this? Why is this important? Because a nation's security is increasingly dependent on the private sector for weapons, services, support, intelligence, the like. And that's not just US national security. It's not just US companies. We find private sector companies across countries around the world more and more actively involved in a nation's national security. It's almost like they're outsourcing national security and military and even military support services, certainly intelligence services, to the private sector. I come from the private sector. I think that that's a wise thing for the governments to do because I think we do it better than most governments. But that's just my opinion. Anyway, but what was cool is when we were creating corporate statecraft, we asked former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld, who's at the time a friend of IWP, actually was a friend of IWP till he passed away. Great guy, and we went to him because he kind of epitomized corporate statecraft for us. Obviously, government, but also he was a CEO of a pharmaceutical company. And he understood things from both perspectives. So he gave us some very wise counsel on things to put in corporate statecraft to make it very valuable and very much on a high-level basis and respected not just in the US, but in other countries as well. So he gave us some great advice. He said, he counseled us, actually. He said, he told us, counseled us on the changing nature of companies, essentially. For example, right after World War II, most companies tended to be very patriotic and closely aligned with U.S. national security interests. It's just the time. But if you look at today, these big multinational corporations, some are the same that are in Ukraine. Like, I'll use Google as an example because I like to trash Google a lot. I know a lot of friends at Google, so it's a friendly trashing. But you look at Google, it's a U.S. company, right? Most people think it is. But is it really? Just because a company is headquartered in the U.S., does it really make it a U.S. company? I think its multinational interests are so pervasive. And Google, long story, very short, Google was asked to work on a project for the U.S. government, and the employees of Google basically signed a petition saying if Google, the executives, agreed to do this U.S. government DoD project, that they would quit or something like that. And so the executives said, no, we're not going to do that, because it was furthering the military interests of the U.S. I'm sorry. I think U.S. companies should do that. That's my opinion. But that's a great example of a U.S.-based company that has such multinational interests that they don't want to piss off anybody, even if it's to the detriment of not supporting their own country's national security. Anyway, many private sector companies today, not merely the governments and militaries, are obviously now operating in modern conflicts. So you'll see companies right alongside militaries, as you do in Ukraine. But it's not just in Ukraine. It's actually all over the world. But in the Ukraine-Russia war, there's particularly the case within information security and cyber environment. You see very clearly private sector companies. The one I'd like to give an example, because I can't talk about all of them, I want to talk about Starlink. Starlink, as I mentioned, Elon Musk, we've read a lot about Starlink in the news lately. I think everyone's heard that Starlink is providing the only internet service in Ukraine currently. And they're also providing intelligence capabilities, advanced communications, GPS, and they are helping to push back on disinformation and misinformation in the Ukraine war, in the Ukraine theater, right? And a couple of things about Starlink. 2 days, I think it was like 2 days after the war began, or after they had actually invaded, Russia took out Ukraine's Viasat, which is the only satellite they had giving the country internet services. And someone from the Ukrainian government called Elon Musk and said, hey, can you give us some satellite? Can you give us some internet service? Within 2 days, Elon Musk had 10,000 satellite terminals in country and had the internet service up and running. And I don't want to get real technical here, but the Starlink satellite service is very different than like an Intelsat or Viasat, your typical satellites. The Starlinks are all what they call LEOs, low Earth orbiting satellites. So, for example, these satellites are maybe 300 miles above the Earth, whereas the big satellites are thousands, 30,000 miles up there. What that enables is clear communication, much stronger communication, but less coverage. So that's they have something like, I think they have like 25,000 of these LEOs Starlink has. So that if they're pointing where they need in Ukraine, it's very good, very clear reception. And anyone who doesn't have good cell service, like where I live, if you don't have very good cell service, you're going around looking somewhere for a good connection, right? Same thing, but it's proving very effective, right? So So today, these 10,000 satellite terminals are now 25,000 satellite terminals that Starlink has provided. And Elon Musk is footing the bill for all of it. So what does that run? It's an order of magnitude like $20 million a month. And it's interesting because he's been doing this since, March of last year. About April or May of last year, Elon Musk went to the U.S. government and went to DOD and said, hey, listen, you guys are paying all these defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, blah, 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 all billions of dollars for weapons, for your services and all that. How about you help pay some of this Starlink $20 million per month? So he submitted this request to the government before the government even came back to him with an answer. This is rumored to be true, but I know someone who said that this has a good fidelity of being true. But Elon Musk withdrew his request, and he said 2 reasons. First of all, if DOD had paid Elon or Starlink for the services provided in Ukraine, it would make Starlink a weapon of war. And Elon didn't want to do that. So, kudos to him for that. But also, and I think this may be probably a bigger part of the reason, Elon Musk found out that the US government actually wanted to kind of get behind the curtain, kind of find out more things about SpaceX and Starlink, how do things actually work, and God forbid the US government have a say-so overruling Elon Musk about what he's going to do with Starlink and where he's going to point it to and when he's going to turn it off in Ukraine. So he said, thanks, never mind, I'll pay for it myself, but it gives him the control, which is a whole nother thing. And I'm not going to go down this rabbit hole right now, but I'll just put it out there that the U.S. Congress is now looking into Elon Musk and Starlink because of an incident a few months ago where Elon Musk turned off the Starlink services when Ukraine was trying to target Russian ships in the Black Sea. I think there was a bunch of them there or something. It was an opportune moment. He turned it off, and because he said not because he wanted to help the Russians, which was the net effect, but it's because he felt like it was going to be such a massive attack that he felt like the only response from Russia would be nuclear. So he said, I was just trying to avoid a nuclear war. He actually said this on Twitter or X or whatever it is, or something to that effect. So now U.S. government, Congress are going, should one man, one private sector company, but really one man, have that much power in a war? And why did he get to say that's what you should or shouldn't do? Because the Ukrainian government called him up, or maybe tweeted him, and said, hey, can you turn it back on? That's something that's out there. But it highlights, I think, the very unique situation that we have with private sector companies that are basically doing hybrid warfare. They are doing warfare. Whether it's information warfare or what they call hot warfare, how much private sector decisions should be made, because they're not policymakers, they're not elected. It's a bit of a, I think it's a bit of a sticky wicket, and I think it's something that's going to be hotly debated around the world until there's some sort of, maybe there's some regulations, God help us, or legislation or something that will kind of regulate this type of private sector capabilities in theater. Anyway, I next want to get to disinformation and misinformation. Whenever I talk about a problem, I like to say, instead of, yeah, here's a problem, thank you very much. I like to say, well, here's a problem, so what can we do about it? Instead of, here's a problem, you guys go work it out. Or talk amongst yourselves, you let me know if you have a solution, blah, blah, blah. So I'm all about, and I co-founded 2 companies. So my startup entrepreneur was like, okay, we got a problem, what are some solutions? So to address disinformation and misinformation, a couple years ago, I created what I mentioned before, the information warfare kill chain. So it's done in, anyone who's seen a cybersecurity kill chain, it's got this kind of, it's 7 points. And the information kill chain is 8 points, but it's kind of done in this cascading thing. I don't want to read all of it, but I encourage everyone to take a look at this. But let me just take you through the steps a little bit. And also I have to say, as a way of attribution, I put this together in this graphic, but I used an article, fantastic article in the Intelligencer magazine. It's an intel community magazine in the US, Washington. Bruce Schneier, he did a fabulous, I don't know, it was maybe 10, 12 pages. So I boiled it down to something that I could read. And I called him and I asked him, I said, listen, I've taken your words and I put it in a kill chain. I just want your permission to use this because I had to present it. And he goes, absolutely. He goes, go ahead, use it. And then, and he goes, can I actually use your graphic of my thing? So yeah, we both gave each other permission. But let me just take you through this, because this applies for information warfare, influence operations, whether it's Russia or China. It could be other countries as well. But I have applied this to some, what we know are disinformation campaigns that have been prosecuted by China in the US right before the 2020 election. Same thing with Russia before the 2020 election. So when I think of disinformation and misinformation, especially propagated by Russia, and specifically Putin, I think, sometimes we don't know if disinformation is really disinformation. And I've heard the definition or difference between disinformation and misinformation is disinformation has an intent to deceive, whereas misinformation is basically repeating disinformation. I mean, you don't know that it's necessarily deceitful or a lie. It doesn't help. But if you see something coming at you, like in cyber threats, if you know something is coming at you, if you can identify it, you have a better chance of disrupting it or preventing it or refuting it. So the same thought with disinformation. If you know what a disinformation campaign looks like, and you know these elements, you can educate your people to say, okay, hang on a second. Let's take this campaign in Ukraine. Okay, Putin said this. Let's kind of break it down. Let's break down how he's using. So let's take it in order. First of all, you find the cracks, the fissures, if you will, in whatever society, and you exploit them. That's the first step, right? Second, you build a base. You have to have an audience, right? And you use whatever platforms. Obviously, Putin uses a lot of the television because he controls them, but whatever the platform is. Next, you seed distortion, right? What they call, fake news. This is where we've all seen the deep fakes and memes and the utilization of that. Very, very effective. But what they call a fire hood of falsehood. Yep. The next, insert kernels of truth. We all know the best lies have some kernels of truth to them, so this is no different. And it does help because it has some sort of air of believability. If one kernel of it is true, all of it must be true, right? And next, conceal your hand. Obviously, the true perpetrator never wants to be revealed. That is a true hallmark of a really good information warfare, influence ops, disinformation campaign. Next, cultivate proxies. We've all seen that. What we call useful idiots. Love that term. I think we all can think of some that would fall in that category. Next, deny involvement. Never, never, never admit the truth. Some people will believe you. And, sometimes, not even sometimes, to the next point, you play the long game because there are always going to be people that believe you. And if you deny the truth, then whatever percentage of people that were going to believe you, obviously you've won. You've influenced them, right? But if you deny, then of course, the jig is up. You might as well. You just went through 6 steps that are a waste of time. So, all right. And I just want to leave you on the playing the long game. Again, it's very Chinese, very Sun Tzu, but it makes a lot of sense. If you play the long game, do it for the long haul, then your information warfare, your influence operations, your disinformation campaigns will take on a life of their own. It has legs. So play the long game, and it will spawn many other, usually disinformation campaigns. So anyway, it's like if you've never seen a unicorn, you don't know what a unicorn looks like. If you see one, you'll be able to identify it. So this is hopefully if you see the steps, when you see a disinformation campaign coming at you, you gotta go, you know what? I don't think that's really right. I think that's a disinformation campaign, or I think that's influence operations. If you know what to look for, you can find it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Michelle. Modern warfare is fascinating. So I think the speed at which things can unfold and the broadness that you were talking about in using all these forms of social media and thousands of microsatellites, et cetera, it's just a different state of affairs. So we'll move on to Gabrielle here.
So thank you very much, and thank you, John and Melissa, for the invitation. We don't talk enough about the space domain in a geostrategic context. Perhaps because space is too cool, actually, and people immediately think of Star Wars, and it's considered too sci-fi for serious conversations very often, which is a mistake. So really, congratulations to the organizers for putting space on the agenda for this conference, because space actually has an increasing bearing on the balance of power and on geopolitics in our times. My main thesis today is that space is not just something out there, an enabler of things we do on the ground, and just a kind of afterthought to questions of strategy, but that it is becoming ever more central to world affairs writ large. So in other words, space is a critical component of state power in the 21st century. So let me dive right in and just look first at how satellites affect our life on Earth and why space is important in a very basic way. And the first thing to say is that space is a vital infrastructure for prosperity in our time. Actually, without space, modern society would simply stop working, because space-enabled services underpin large chunks of our economy. So take, for example, the financial sector, which is enabled by precise time stamping of financial transactions with global time distributed by GPS from space. So, for example, you couldn't have bank ATMs working without that timing signal. In transport, from air transportation to maritime navigation, not to mention all the smart mobility solutions coming up, all supported by space. Telecoms use precise timing for bandwidth management, satellite backhaul for data transfer, and now, of course, satellite broadband like Starlink or OneWeb, and soon direct phone-to-satellite connectivity. So mobile communications worldwide depend on space. Also, for example, look at the green agenda and things like ESG that were mentioned yesterday. All of that is really based on data about climate change. Guess where that comes from? It doesn't happen without climate monitoring from space, because most of the variables they need to model climate change are only observable by satellites. Which I guess is reason enough to take out the satellites, right? But so the big trend here is the ever deeper intertwining of the internet, so digital economy, with space-derived big data, to the point where they depend on each other. So I think we are seeing an important strategic technology convergence, which only, again, makes space power more relevant in the 21st century. And the implications of this are profound. Space capacity writ large, the systems, capabilities, the space industrial base available to a given state, all of this is morphing into a center of gravity, but also into a tool of statecraft in its own right, which means two things. A center of gravity is something, of course, that can be attacked and that you must defend. And in fact, defending the space center of gravity, particularly the in-orbit infrastructure, is what is driving a lot of the hardening of space programs around the world. And secondly, space power, in terms of your mastery of space technology and the space infrastructure that you can deploy in orbit and on Earth, are things that you can leverage for prosperity at home, or indeed for influence abroad, that is for national power. So just to illustrate, in 2016, the Chinese launched the Space Silk Road concept, also known as the Belt and Road Initiative Space Information Corridor. It's a component of BRI. And this is about China offering access to its satellite data, offering partnerships in building satellites, as well as space ground infrastructure through to applications. So by signing up to the Space Information Corridor, states participating in the BRI would become dependent on Chinese-provided space services such as Baidu, the Chinese GPS that John mentioned earlier. So you see the integrated vision, the physical infrastructure in orbit that enables a whole space applications and data ecosystem. And like with the Huawei issue that was also alluded earlier today, is designed to lock countries into a technological dependency. So this is partly how you can use space power to advance your geopolitical goals. And now on to the military dimension, which is the fun part. Space is critical to modern military operations across three functions. Number one, communication, so battlefield and beyond the horizon connectivity. Intelligence, surveillance and reconnaissance, ISR, for targeting and navigation. GPS for precision strike. So obviously we can see all of this at play in Ukraine, where, as you know, as Michel was also mentioning, there is tremendous involvement from commercial companies, including commercial space companies. In terms of Starlink connectivity, the Ukrainians use Starlink to share targeting data very quickly for artillery fires. Effectively, they've now got a networked artillery system that uses apps like something called GIS ARTA that they've developed in Ukraine, which allows, for example, forward drone operator who geolocates an enemy target. You can literally just input the data onto the tablet into an app, which via Starlink updates the picture at headquarters. So the bottom line here that this shortens the kill chain, the actual hard kill chain, and lets you do more damage with less ammunition, basically. In terms of ISR sensors, just to give you a flavor of the tech involved. So in terms of optical sensors, so literally photos from space, very useful to see what's on the battlefield, identify things. So the commercial standard is about 30 centimeters ground linear resolution. So you can see someone holding an iPad, for example. But very soon, perhaps in the next couple of years, we'll see a commercial standard of about maybe 10 centimeters. Synthetic aperture radar, another type of sensor, unlike optical, works through clouds and at night. The top of the range resolution there is 16 centimeters, just been in the commercial in the commercial sector. It's been just been demonstrated in August, but the standard is about 25 centimeters. Another type of sensor is radio frequency geolocation, very useful. So it detects radio emissions from electronic warfare assets, so radar emissions, jammer emissions, and also, of course, radio communications on the ground and cell phone usage and all of this. It's very useful to identify units, understand patterns of activity, and so on. Thermal sensors, they detect heat in a commercial setting, usually used to identify things like forest fires, now very useful in Ukraine to detect explosions and to track artillery use across the battlefield and do a lot of clever data analysis on that. So in Ukraine we have SATCOM, so satellite communications, ISR and GPS. So all of these combine to support the deep fight, right? The ability to take out targets deep in the Russian rear with long-range precision fires, which is a very, very complex business. It requires creating fire corridors through sequenced strikes supported by a fusion of data from all these different sensors. So it's very sophisticated, but this is what has given Ukraine the edge over Russian artillery in many cases, even though in a numerical sense they are obviously outnumbered by Russian artillery. Thus, space has a practical effect on the battlefield where it can negate key traditional advantages in the classic domains and weapons categories. So add space to the equation, and I think the military balance shifts. Still, there is room for improvement, especially on the remote sensing and targeting front. So today, the US military can image any point on Earth about 5 times a day. So imagine the possibilities when when it will become possible to do it 5 times a second. And these are not my words. This is from a conversation I had almost like 4 years ago with the then Secretary of the US Air Force, Heather Wilson. So we're just kind of scratching the surface of what you can do from space to support the fight in the land domain. But space power is also altering the balance in maritime environments and would play a major role in a Taiwan contingency. And this is because essentially command of space is becoming the foundation for the command of the sea. The modern air-sea battle that we can expect in the Western Pacific, given the huge distances, is really all about long-range strikes in a very crude way. So put simply, the Chinese strategy is to use missiles, including hypersonic missiles, to keep the US Navy out or to sink it. So the ability to defend against the missile threat is essential. And to defend, you have to detect the launch immediately, acquire the target, track it, send the data to interceptors. And I agree with what JV was saying yesterday, that we do need to build more missiles and replenish our stockpiles and all that. But in terms of the tracking, space is vital for all that, for tracking and targeting missile threats. You can only do it from space. This is why the Pentagon, for example, is building something that's called a proliferated warfighting space architecture. So this is a multi-orbit constellation, different layers of satellites with different functions, and that there's really nothing like it. And it's a big project that can give the US a huge advantage when it's fully deployed. So again, when it comes to the military balance in the Indo-Pacific, we've had some touch on this in conversations at this conference so far, how easy or how difficult it is to defend Taiwan. That's a moving picture. So technology can play a big role and can change and alter that military balance. As for the Chinese, they understand all of this. They understand the critical value of space power. They have an official goal, national goal, to be the world leader in space by 2049. Part of this called China's space dream. President Xi has spoken about this. And they've got a massive space program. So last year alone, the Chinese government put about 200 satellites up. Half of them, over 100 of them, were ISR satellites, so supporting the Chinese joint force. So they're building that capability as well. So if we put all of this together, we see how space stacks up as the element that can increasingly swing the military balance. And the more space assets you have, the more possibilities of linking them and working with allies, and the more opportunities to change that military balance, and even to introduce strategic surprise. So speaking of surprise, the other factor here are new space technologies. They've been long in development, and some of them are now ready to come online. But again, we don't talk about them too much until they'll hit us in the face. So, my favorite example here are space planes. The X-37B, the American version, perhaps better known, but the Chinese also have one called the Shenlong. Test models, both of these exist and operate today in orbit. They're up there. So in terms of space technology today, the analogy, if you want to make a historical analogy, in my view, the analogy is where air power was in about 1918, when we had crude canvas aeroplanes, and only 3 decades later, in the 40s, we had jet fighters. So, what capabilities will be available in the 2050s? So we can easily imagine, for example, fleets of space bombers in a much shorter time frame. So all of this is, the tech is proven. Needs to be developed further and so on. It takes a while to field these things, but it's inevitable. So governments should factor this type of development into their long-term thinking on the military balance. And we do it for submarines, for example, but not for space. Why? So we have AUKUS with a horizon of deployed capability in the 2040s, like literally breaking the ground today in Australia on the infrastructure to support AUKUS. And the whole program is a 30-year program going into the 2050s. But our planning goes nowhere near that horizon for space power, and that's a mistake, I think. Final question, of course, is what is the future of space power? Improving satellites, yes, as we've discussed, but space tech is also now breaking open new frontiers from an operational perspective, beyond Earth orbit. Already there are about 100 missions of various types going to the moon, from across the world by 2030. So 100 missions in the next few years. So the question is, how do you build space power outwards from Earth in the cislunar space and dominate that new space terrain for both military and economic advantage? I mean, it sounds science fiction, but it's actually what is happening. So just to summarize, space is a critical infrastructure as well as big business in its own right. It's become a center of gravity that we must defend and that can also be used to advance geopolitical interests. Space power is shifting conventional military balances both in the land domain and in the maritime domain. And there's a lot more coming on that front. And finally, just looking outward from Earth orbit, we are in the foothills, I think, of a great strategic struggle for dominance of cislunar space. So, I urge you to pay more attention to space power because it really matters. Thank you.
Yeah, really taken by the ultimate high ground. I mean, in the 1800s, it was hot air balloons, and then, U-2 and SR-71, and now everything's in space. And I understand to your point about the commercialization, privatization of capabilities in the cyber domain, space launch in the commercial sector far outpaces what's in the government. So I think to the individual with the most interesting tagline, what is it now? The defense or professor of war in the modern world, Department of War Studies. There's no ambiguity there, is there? So David, take us home.
No ambiguity, indeed. There won't be any ambiguity in my presentation. I'd also like to thank Danube and Heritage for the invitation to be here, which has been terrific, and for assembling such a elevated audience. And I will apologize for bringing the tone down and admitting that the spirit that underpins my presentation this morning are two 4chan memes. One is, if only you knew how bad things really are. If you know the meme, you know it. If you don't, you don't. The other is, hey buddy, things seem really scary right now, but they're going to get much worse.
Why are people applauding that?
It's all in the delivery. A recent study of post-Second World War civil wars concluded that in countries where the conditions of civil war are present, the chances in any given year of it breaking out are 4%. 4%, which is an important number to bear in mind when, on account of the thesis I'll present to you today, which is to say that the conditions of civil war are incipient, if not present, or are present in the ideal throughout almost all countries of the Western world, including primarily with those in the most ideal place for war in terms of civil war causation being the biggest ones. Which is to say that over the coming years, things are going to get much, much worse. This is a statistically probable conclusion. So, bottom line up front. Now, let me explain a bit why that is going to happen, and also what it's going to look like. All right. Main thing is I put two pictures up, or a picture and a quote up here. Most people in this room are of a sufficient vintage to recognize the picture on the right hand of the slide. The quote is from Josip Borrell, more recently describing Europe as a garden and the rest of the world as a jungle. My point here is that both of these are an illustration of hubris. The basic idea of the Pentagon's new map was that war was a thing which was going to occur in that central area, in the non-integrating gap, and not so much in the other areas. Borrell, 20 plus years later, is essentially reflecting something the same idea. I very much doubt that Borrell had read Pentagon's new map, maybe perhaps he had, but he's evoking the same ideal. I think future dictionaries are going to include that quote as an illustration of the definition of hubris. And that is because the dominant threats to the Western world, the dominant threats to your life, your well-being, and the lives and well-being of your children and grandchildren are not external, they are internal. They stem from the sputtering economic strength of the West, which has been talked about at length by other presenters, so I'll not dwell on the issue, but also its increasing social incohesion. On top, both factors being massively aggravated by elite pusillanimity and incompetence. Generally speaking, basically the message here is that the West, in terms of capital, is at the end of the line. This graph here, you'll have seen this particular graph. Some of you may recognize this. It's from Ray Dalio's book, and it's effectively a simplified graphic representation of the life cycle of empire. There are a number of variants of this and theories on this, but they all tend to have this pattern, or sometimes in the classic Greek pattern being circular. But at any rate, it goes like this. At the beginning of a new hegemonic order, or as going from left to right along that rising curve, you have a rising power where elites are increasingly competent, wealth is increasing overall, and the perception on the part of governed people that the system is capable of producing desirable outcomes and of acting coherently in a coherent community interest is very strong. As you get to the top, unfortunately, you move through, and those things decline over time. The period Dalio talks about 100 years. The other variants exist. The main thing is the curve. Underneath that curve, that's the happy zone. That's where you want to be as a society. That's where you've got plenty of wealth, you've got plenty of competent people running things, you've got plenty of happy people working industriously, not requiring Big Brother looking over their shoulder to make sure that they're not stepping out of line or thinking the wrong things. The space on the top, above that line, is the unhappy zone. Unhappily, I shall tell you, we are now somewhere between 5 and 6, and according to that scale. And you can see, as Dalio puts it there, 5 and 6 is bad financial conditions, intense conflicts, ultimately civil wars and revolutions. So that's one aspect of the answer to why this is going to happen, and I think that is broadly in line with many of the things you heard yesterday. I want to talk, though, about another form of capital, which is social capital. Social capital is one of the most important, most significant ideas in modern sociology. It's been studied, measured, evaluated, argued about for over 40 years. What we know about social capital, and no one disagrees, no sociologist disagrees, that social capital is diminishing in Western societies. The rapidity of the decline and the scale of the decline, this is debated. But nobody debates, nobody questions that it is in decline. The figure up here is that's the number of people who agreed with the an American poll. The number of people who agreed with the statement, I do not have confidence that our current leaders will be able to successfully address our country's challenges. 66%. That's a good number. Current number is much higher. I would say another way of understanding this in more conventional, less jargon terms is to think about trust and confidence and the perception of legitimacy. These are all the same ideas. And what we can see throughout Western society, in all Western societies, rather, is a rapid and precipitate drop in trust. Trust in institutions is at extremely low levels. It varies across institutional types, politicians, lawyers, journalists, way down at the bottom, not quite in single digits, but in the teens, the low teens. And as you get towards doctors, clerics, things like that, little bit higher perception of trust. Although recently the trust evinced in the medicine has also plummeted for quite obvious reasons. Okay, so we've got a collapse of capital and we've got a collapse of social capital, a collapse of trust. Now, as I said, nobody questions that this is happening. The question where there is a debate is what's causing it. Here we come to cohesion. It's been over 13 years now, since Angela Merkel pointed the finger at multiculturalism. She said it has failed. In fact, her words were translated into English. I'm choosing to believe, in this case, the BBC, making an accurate translation, was that it had been a disaster. 6 months later, in practically the same words, David Cameron said the same thing. State multiculturalism has failed. He went on to explain that what it results in is the ghettoization of groups with no coherent identity. And what this reflects is a society which has very low cohesion. It doesn't possess a strong overarching group identity, and that is a massive problem. Okay. It leads to factionalism. We hear this word talked about a lot. What I mean by factionalism is essentially a combination of these three, of what I just discussed, but also three of these other ideas which I'll mention briefly. Firstly, political polarization, about which we're all familiar and I think generally understand to be the divergence of political attitudes away from the center towards, I've said extreme, but actually I think the problem is that the term extreme is itself rather elusive in definition. But we can say it's away from the center. It's very difficult now to hold a centrist position on any given issue because of the nature of our politics, which push people towards the edges, whether they wish to or not. That's political polarization. A less talked about, but I think a very important idea, is that of pre-political loyalty. This is a term coined by the English conservative philosopher Roger Scruton, and what he meant by pre-political loyalty is this form of trust that precedes and is superior to politics. And it's really very, very important because it's that which allows a nation to continue to function after a national election where some fraction of the population is pissed because their candidate didn't win. If everyone shares the same pre-political loyalty, you accept the decision and you wait the next election, or you work towards the next election and getting your guy in. Pre-political loyalty throughout the West has also fractured along with factionalization. The pre-political loyalties of large fractions of the populations of many Western countries has nothing to do with their nominal passport. There are many illustrations of this. This is a particular one. That is a scene from Leicester in the Midlands in England. It's recent rioting between Pakistani and Indian communities, not over issues relating to British policy, but over issues in distant South Asia. These are all British passport holders. Most of them are second or third generation immigrants. In this case, the fighting was preceded by a Hindu mob marching through the Muslim area, chanting "Death to Pakistan." What's important about this scene is none of these people, although despite being British, are fighting over anything really relating to Britain. Their pre-political loyalty, in other words, is elsewhere than British. Post-nationalism is a related concept, we've heard a bit about it. I've heard it said a bit yesterday. Post-nationalism is another way of putting it. It is a term that is generally applied to elites. Most of our elites are trained in Western institutions to be post-national in their outlook, to be highly skeptical of nationalism, say. John Venable mentioned this yesterday. His own discomfort, a 25-year Air Force veteran feeling discomfort over. Why? And that is because our culture, for coming on to 2-3 generations now, has inculcated in its most educated, most senior people, an ideology of post-nationalism, which has resulted in the situation where most national leaders in the Western world don't have a concept of national interest. They talk about national interest, but they don't conceive. They don't conceive it, and can't conceive it. The same may be said for most national bureaucracies. This is particularly evident in the UK over the Brexit issue, where it really came to the fore. Anyway, factionalism, cohesion down, factionalism up, like a ladder. Okay, so my point here is that we are already at the tipping point. Tipping point is a bit of a cliche, but it works. You know what I mean when I say tipping point. This is an idea which is fairly widely expressed and held by a range of scholars, including the author of the book where the graph on the left originates, which is in the work of the American scholar Peter Turchin, and his work on the life cycle of civilizations. And he has come up with this idea of the double spiral of well-being, the plunging of well-being, and elite overproduction. That situation where you've got popular well-being being low and elite overproduction being high is the most tumultuous. It is the situation most likely to lead to significant outbreaks of domestic internal turmoil. Another way of putting it, again, is although it's political participation process, actually, this is from a sociology journal, and this is a spectrum of politics. On the left, you've got conventional politics, what we all think of the normal rules of the game, contentious politics, where you think of the 1960s and perhaps of particularly symbolic or difficult issues. I mentioned Brexit. That would be another very good example of contentious politics. And there's factionalism, which you can break down in two ways. There is issue factionalism, where people feel very strongly about an issue, take abortion, or again Brexit for that matter. Then there is polar factionalism. Polar factionalism differs from issue factionalism because it has less to do with the issue at hand and more to do with what are the consensus attitudes within your tribe. Which is why yesterday, one of the questions raised was, how did gas become evil, right? The same people talking 10, 15, 20 years ago about gas being clean energy now see gas as anathematic, as basically killing the planet. How does that happen? Well, that happens in a political environment that is dominated by polar factionalism, and in which case the issue matters less than what you're signaling to others within your primary affinity group. This is the held belief within my affinity group. That is going to be my belief also. I think even a better example of this is the acceptance, for example, of the existence of a gender spectrum, which practically no one on the planet accepted or even thought of 15 or 20 years ago, but is now the dominant idea amongst a good part of the population. In short, we're already at polar factionalism. We're trending to militancy. When you hear the words civil war, if you're American, you probably get an image of the American Civil War. If you're Chinese, perhaps you get an image of the Chinese Civil War, both of which were big, continental-scale, conventional conflicts between organized, regular armies over a sustained period. What's important to note is that's one type of civil war. Civil war varies in types, and I'll just mention two. Civil war at the top, as conventionally understood as the big regular division, is one. Another is what is sometimes referred to as dirty war. This is a term taken from Latin America, specifically from Argentina, but it's often broadly applied to Latin America, Central America, Guatemala, Honduras, like. And that's a civil war, generally of very long duration, low intensity, generally lacking in large organized military campaigns, and characterized by things like kidnapping, assassination of political, media, judicial figures, police, and the like, terrorism, in other words, sometimes terrorism with different differing sorts of target patterns. But an example of that is Argentina of the 1970s and 80s, with death squads and people plunging out of helicopters from very high altitude from time to time. I don't think what we're headed towards, at least not initially, although it might metastasize into something much larger, I don't think we're headed towards a grand-scale Chinese-style or American mid-19th century style civil war, but something much more like a Latin American dirty war, in which people like yourselves and me, I hope, can insulate ourselves to some degree from the chaos around us through our wealth and ability to fortify ourselves in place or to develop bolt holes that we can go to. All right, so I mentioned polarization a lot, and generally speaking, the dominant problem is polarization, but there is also a curious consensus. If you spend time amongst anti-status quo groups, as I have done over the last 15 to 20 years, and you don't particularly care whether it's left or right ones, you realize they're reading all of the same stuff. They're saying almost all of the same things. They perceive most problems in the same way. They typically use the same language, and they have the same sorts of guidances. On the left is a recent one that was published. Michael Flynn is one of the authors of it. That was published, I believe, last year, 2022, might have been 2021, clearly after the last election. And on the right, The Coming Insurrection is slightly older. This is an originally French tract. It comes from the left. It was published in 2007. The clue is in the title, The Coming Insurrection. Citizen's Guide to Fifth Generation, putting the same, it could be the same title, frankly, it's just in slightly different language, but it's really fundamentally the same thing. I would encourage you to read them side by side if you wish to verify that. The most commonly agreed with political statement in the United States, Canada, and the UK, according to a Pew research. It was done in other countries, but I can't remember the numbers from all of the countries. But from the Anglo countries, the most commonly agreed with political statement is that voting makes no difference. It's not a left-right issue. The median political position is that voting makes no difference. I put to you that is a very clear sign of acute bad health in a political system, and it is an attitude that's very acute in the youth population, but it's also where that's relatively commonly held position. What's interesting is it's now increasingly a position held across age groups, and particularly in older groups, older people who heretofore have been the most invested in the status, or are the most invested in the status quo, and the most likely to defend it. So when that number starts to go down, I think that's, if I was a doctor reading a chart, I would think, okay, I thought I was worried about this guy's heart, brain, liver, spleen, but now, oh shit, kidneys are going too. Okay, so that's where we are. You'll have heard this term, the Great Replacement. I know you've heard it because everybody's heard it. You haven't been talking about it because it's really not talked about in polite company, which I assume this to be. But you should. You should be familiar with it. The book here is originally French because the term comes from this fellow, Renaud Camus. And you don't need to be shy about talking about it. You should just talk about it in the way that academics talk about it, which is we use the term downgrading. This is perfectly fine at all dinner parties, but it means exactly the same thing. Downgrading is the perception of a dominant or formerly or incipiently or soon to be non-dominant group that it is in a situation of status reversal, not just political defeats. Dominant groups go from a situation where one moment they get to decide whose language is spoken, whose laws are enforced, whose culture is revered, to a situation where they do not. That is a very powerful narrative. We know it's very powerful because of how quickly and effectively it is propagated. If we break it down from a narrative perspective, if you look at it as a strategic communicator, for example, also, it's a very powerful narrative. It has a very obvious grievance. It has a very clearly defined community. It's got a plausible means of rectification of the problem. That is why it is so worrisome to people who track the movement of ideas through society. I'm almost finished, okay? All right. What's it going to look like? Well, the main thing is it's going to have an urban-rural dimension to it. Obviously, this is a heat map or a political map of the United States. That's voting patterns. Americans here reverse the colors, which always confuse me. But it's Republicans in red and Democrats in blue. You can see these basically there is a strong correlation, very strong correlation between urban areas and voting patterns. There is also a very strong correlation between race and voting patterns. These things are not coincidental. They are part of the same argument. This map here, the one on the right, is of Britain, and that shows that is essentially breaks down the racial demographic of Britain, which you can see is very concentrated in the south, in the central areas, and into a handful of the very biggest cities. Now, if you accept, therefore, that civil war is incipient, was a potential, if not, well, at least in potential, and that like 75% of all civil wars since the end of the Second World War will ultimately have an ethnic character to it, driven by perception of downgrading, then it follows that it's going to track the demographic patterns, which show a strong urban versus rural distinction. Which brings me to the last slide, second to last slide, which is the strategic logic. If you are in the rural areas, i.e. the area operated by the dominant majority, which feels itself to be downgrading, how are you going to attack the cities? You're going to go after the infrastructure. This is so obvious and so widely talked about in these groups that there's really not much question about it. I encourage you to do as I have done and will continue to do because it's morbidly fascinating. Go around your own country asking yourself this question: how could I break that? How could I break that? One individual of not particularly grave means. It's surprising how many things you can break. High-tension electrical pylons, unguarded. Most of the major gas network, unguarded. In fact, unguardable. Communications nodes, mostly unguarded. Most of these mapped out in incredible detail and publicly available knowledge because it has to be. Because if you dig somewhere and you break a major accident hazard pipeline, clues in the name, you're going to blow things up. So the state wants you to know where these many hundreds of miles long explosive devices are laid. Britain, you know what Britain looks like. The City of London, the UK gas network, like all networks, is served by gas compression stations. You've got a lot of pipes, and you've got a bunch of stations to keep the pressure up in those pipelines. London, the City of London, 10 million people, is served by 2 compression stations. One of them is located just south of Cambridge near the RAF Museum, rather ironically. Go to the RAF Museum and also drive past that gas compression station. It's in a light industrial area. It's no more heavily guarded than the light industrial facility that is next door. If you think of the basic unit of assessment in most counterterrorism prevention is the truck bomb. 7.5-ton truck bomb, two-axle engine over truck bomb, carrying about 1,200 pounds of TNT. It's no more difficult getting in there than it would be to get into the average American high school. In other words, this is what's coming. This is what's coming according to mainstream social science. There's nothing I've said there in terms of the understanding of how societies work or what the demographics are that isn't perfectly well understood and that has not been talked about for many, many years. That's it. Yeah, I'll leave you there. All right.
I think today the coming unrest is more a desire for food. But please, another round of applause for David, for Gabriel, and for Michelle.